Good morning, folks. Today we will be talking about the chapter concerning ethical egoism in Russ Schaefer Landau's The Fundamentals of Ethics. Last time we had a conversation about psychological egoism and why that issue is worth talking about in the context of normative ethics, even though psychological egoism is not a normative ethical theory. Recall that psychological egoism is a theory of motivation, or a theory of human nature. It contended that we always act out of what we believe to be in our own self-interest, and that there are no exceptions. No matter what you do, you are acting out of your own self-interest. The reason why psychological egoism is not a normative ethical theory is because normative theories tell us what we ought to do. They don't merely explain what we do or have a tendency to do. Now, we will be discussing ethical egoism today, and you'll see I've abbreviated in the notes as EE for simplicity. Ethical egoism is a normative theory, even though I'll make this nasty little remark about it. Most philosophers, most legitimate philosophers, find it to be severely lacking, and we'll talk about why. Even though there is some popularity among some regular folks of ethical egoism, partly because they like the political ramifications of it, or they think they like the political ramifications of it, and in some cases, some of their favorite politicians have said that one of the main thinkers of ethical egoism, Ayn Rand, is among their heroes. People also falsely equate ethical egoism with a political philosophy called libertarianism. The author of our text takes great lengths to explain why while libertarianism and ethical egoism have some things in common, they are actually logically inconsistent with one another. They are actually logically inconsistent with one another. So your libertarian friends who say that they are ethical egoists are actually contradicting themselves, perhaps because they don't understand either libertarianism well enough or ethical egoism well enough. Sadly enough, that's how folks sometimes are. We oftentimes hold points without fully thinking them through and so forth. Myself included, I'm pretty sure. But anyway, now the author of the text contends that ethical egoism is a genuine ethical theory because it tells us what we ought to do. It says that we ought to do what? That we ought to seek our own self-interest. Now keep in mind that psychological egoism and ethical egoism are not necessarily positions that go together, but the author contends that it would be convenient for ethical egoism if psychological egoism were also true. Because first and foremost, if indeed we always and only act out of our own self-interest, it would seem very strange for us to expect you not to do so. In other words, if all you can do is act out of your own self-interest, then it would make sense to pursue your self-interest, because that is what you do. So that's why the author says it would be convenient for ethical egoism if psychological egoism were true. But they are not necessary correlates of one another. Now, I'll continue. Now, ethical egoism is generally criticized by most ethicists on these and often more grounds. And I kind of touched on that a little bit without giving the details in my little short intro. First, it generally counsels the opposite of what most normative theories suggest. Now, recall that we earlier remarked that if a new theory comes along that turns everything we take for granted on our head, it will have what? The stronger burden of proof. In other words, if a theory comes along that says, hey guys, everything you typically thought of as moral is now immoral, that person had better have really good arguments to lead us to change our minds. Because most of us believe that we have good reasons to think that altruism, at least how we define it, is generally speaking an ethically good thing, even though we might have different reasons for thinking altruism is good. But what ethical egoism contends is that altruism is bad, selfishness is good. It says that you always ought to act in ways that you believe will pursue your own self-interest. And here's what the author also talks about. It's what he calls the argument for paradigm cases. Now, when we call certain things paradigm cases, we mean excellent examples of. Some paradigm cases of immorality are things like stealing, rape, murder, slavery. I mean, we could go on with paradigm cases of immorality. Now, if those things happen to benefit you, take a guess what ethical egoism says you ought to do. Yes, if harming other people intentionally benefits you, that it doesn't just say that you can do it, it says that you should do it. Now, most of us don't happen to think that acting out of self-interest, not only does it not define morality, but we think that there are other things that are morally significant. So if a theory comes along and says, doing intentional damage to other people is the right thing to do if it benefits you, we are right to look that theory over very thoroughly before we say, "Yaha, I think this is a good theory." Next, the author talks about two popular arguments for ethical egoism. I am going to run through these things slowly, but I first want to reiterate something that I said before. Note that the most influential 20th century account in favor of ethical egoism comes from Ayn Rand. That was her pen name. She's known largely for some of her novels, such as Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead, as well as other writings. This will not be on the test, but she referred to her own philosophy as objectivism. Her critics would call it a form of radical subjectivism that says that the only thing that matters is you, yourself, and everything else around you is merely an object for you to help to maximize your interest. That's what her critics would say, that she calls her philosophy objectivism. She also wrote a shorter book, an essay called The Virtue of Selfishness. Now you see the ideas already seem to go against what most people take for granted about morality. Most of us are trained to think that selfishness is what? It's not a virtue. It's not a nice thing. Many of you have religions that have taught you that behaving selfishly isn't a good thing. Many of the normative theories that we will talk about will suggest that we ought to minimally be altruistic for one reason or another. Mr. Dukes.
I'm kind of confused because self-interest and selfishness means two different things. Self-interest is better myself, and by me elevating myself in the best interest, elevates the people that are around. But being selfish is to grab something, take it just for me and not share it with no one else.
Well, and that's part of why she was probably blunt in calling her book The Virtue of Selfishness. And let me continue with this, and I hope I'll answer your question in the process. And I'm going a little bit beyond the text in explaining this. For her, the highest ideal is this. Whoops. The highest ideal is the individual. Now, what she contends is that most of the philosophy, she says all of the philosophies up to this point, basically says that the individual does not matter. You know, most of our philosophies most of our normative ethics will argue that some version of altruism is a morally good thing. In other words, we shouldn't just do what with ourselves? Put ourselves first. Now, she actually goes a little bit further and says that other normative ethics tell us basically to say that our own individual interests count for nothing, and that we're supposed to just do what? Look out for other people. Now, folks, not only is she critical of ethical theories that she would contend tell the individual that she has to become a doormat for everybody else. But, and I say this right here, I said, her positions were certainly consistent with strains of the American ideology at the time of their writing, as they supported the notion of rugged individualism. In other words, nobody owes you anything. If you're going to make anything of yourself, you've got to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps and do it on your own. And if you expect anything of anyone else, you're the loser. You're a taker. Yes.
I think it's important to understand, like, I didn't know if you were going to mention this, but like to understand like the social context of like where she grew up. And okay, like living in a completely like communist.
Yeah.
Like dictatorship.
Yeah.
Government.
Yeah. And granted, she came out of Eastern Europe. So when she came to this country, her she was already anti-communist, but her works ended up being very instrumental in fighting the Cold War in a particular way. Her arguments will be very anti-collectivism in all of their forms, suggesting that all forms of collectivism will necessarily lead to what? I'm doing this for effect a little bit. All forms of collectivism will ultimately lead to the gulag. In other words, radical tyranny where the individual is crushed. Folks, was this consistent with the Cold War ideology in America?
No.
Yeah. The second Red Scare? Rooting out communists because the idea was communism does what to the individual? The individual doesn't matter. What matters, according to this account of communism? Now, my communist friends would say that Ayn Rand set up a straw man of communism. Because most communists are not pro-dictatorship. As a matter of fact, most of them would self-identify as radical proponents of radical democracy. The word starts with an A. That's anarchism. Anarchists are also typically what in our popular culture? Oh, misrepresented. Because anarchists never say, hey man, do what you want, no government. That's actually a misrepresentation. Actual philosophical anarchists will say, individuals with rational minds recognize that they have a deep responsibility. And we also have the capacity for self-government. Now, because we have the capacity for self-government, we would find out that rationally speaking, because we live among what? We live among other people. We actually do have duties to other people. And it actually behooves us to learn to do what with one another? That is, work together. In other words, find ways of cooperating. And not necessarily just doing what? Competing. I've gone a little further than I planned to go with this, but it's probably not a bad thing. The American ideology, remember, is centered around radical competition. And this kind of leads us, I guess before I go to this argument here. Now, I'll just name you two political figures that most of you probably heard their names before. Rand Paul a ranking member of the Republican Congress, has remarked that Ayn Rand is among his major influences, much to the chagrin of his Catholic parish priest. More on that in a minute. Rand Paul, U.S. Senator from the state of Kentucky, got his name from her. Yeah. His daddy, Ron Paul, gave him this name for a reason. These people libertarianism is their ideology. Now, if you read the chapter, you've already found out that ethical egoism and libertarianism have some inconsistencies. But they do have things in common. And this is the main thing they have in common. Their championship of the individual and individualism. And this is why many people will equate the two and maybe mistake them for equivalencies when they're not actually equivalent. Now, this is going to be a sort of answer to Mr. Duke's question in an indirect way. The author of the text will look at two popular arguments for ethical egoism and then proceed to show why they are either flawed arguments or they're not actually arguments for ethical egoism at all. Now, the first of these arguments he refers to as the self-reliance argument. The now deceased philosopher Louis Poyman, when he explains this argument, he actually gave it the moniker the economist argument. He called it the economist argument because it's sort of a watered-down version of Adam Smith's argument a la the wealth of nations. Adam Smith, the father of modern economics, laissez-faire capitalism, all that stuff. Now let me read this to you. This is the way the author frames the self-reliance argument. The most effective way of making everyone better off is for each to mind his or her own business and tend to his or her own needs. Most libertarians would hold that position, by the way. Now, the second premise is we ought to take the most effective path to making everyone better off. Therefore, we should each mind our own business and tend to our own needs. If we want to make everyone better off, then we should mind our own business and tend our own needs. We do want to make people better off. Therefore, we should mind our own business and tend to our own needs. Now, the author of the text says there's a problem with this argument. First and foremost, the first premise is inconsistent with ethical egoism. Does anyone know why? No, not the first, the second, excuse me. The second premise says we ought to take the most effective path to making everyone better off. That statement is inconsistent with ethical egoism because ethical egoism says you're not supposed to be concerned about anyone else. You're supposed to just be concerned about yourself. So even though this argument is valid among his opponents, the second premise is inconsistent with ethical egoism. It's false if you're an ethical egoist. So this is not a good argument. Now, folks, we ought to take the most effective path to making everyone better off. That's a position that an altruist would take. So even if this argument were valid and sound, it wouldn't be an argument for ethical egoism at all. It would be an argument for some form of altruism. Now, the author of the text goes a little bit further. He contends that the first premise is false. It is based upon a questionable assumption. The idea that we ought to just mind our own business and look out for number one is actually incompatible with what? It is incompatible with our concept of a community, of society. And by the way, if I took that viewpoint, my children certainly wouldn't be better off. The people who I deal with wouldn't be better off if we just minded our own business. and not to go, yeah, I'll go off on this a little bit. I hope if you're a religious person, you don't hold that point of view. As a matter of fact, you're supposed to be everybody's what if you're a Christian? Love thy neighbor, not ignore your neighbor. Or not just say fend for yourself, neighbor. Now, of course, she holds that position randomly, not to be a strong position. But we'll talk more about that in a minute. Turn the page. The next argument that's sometimes used in favor of ethical egoism, the author calls, oh, there it is, the Libertarian Argument. As previously noted, many supporters of libertarianism are Rand fans. I said this before. And cite, that should be a C. It's what happens when you pound out new notes too early. And cite her work as a major influence. The problem is that while libertarianism and ethical egoism have attributes in common, and I said that attribute they have in common is their championship of individualism. And if you champion individualism, you're likely to say, what about intrusive government? Not a good thing. Too much government is a bad thing. It infringes upon what a solid libertarian would call our individual rights. Now, this focus on the individual is certainly something that EE and libertarianism have in common. And that's one of the reasons why there's confusion here. But let me read on. As I said here, they have elements that are irreconcilably inconsistent. Ethical egoism says we only have duties to whom? Ourselves. Libertarianism actually articulates duties. What does libertarianism contend are our duties? I have them up here. Reparation and consent. Now, the ethical egoist says our only duties are to ourselves. Now, keep in mind, an ethical egoist might try to reconcile this position, and I'm going a little bit beyond the text here, by saying that in general, ethical egoism would say that we should make reparations. Because even if we don't want to make reparations when we've done harm, it tends to do what for us in the long run? Yeah, it tends to benefit us. Why does it tend to benefit us? Well, at minimum, if we try to make things right, people will trust us, whether they should trust us or not. In other words, it will tend to benefit you in the end. Now, the author of the text would point out that egoistic argument that making reparations when we've done a harm doesn't really answer the question here. Because libertarians would say, because other people matter too. In other words, other people have what that you have. A major piece in the libertarian argument is the idea that individuals have rights. In other words, other people have what that you also have, according to this. Not just rights, but other people have value too. And that you have a duty to respect their rights. And a major rung in the libertarian argument is you have a duty to back off and not interfere with other people's rights. Now, the author of the text says that ethical egoism would never say this. Because if it benefits you to disrespect another person's rights and you can get away with it and you benefit from it, you should what? You should disrespect a person's rights. Now, we'll come back to the question of moral rights before we leave the chapter. Now, the other reason I think that the theories are sometimes thought of as equivalent is because of this emphasis in libertarianism, not just on reparation, but consent. Government has no right to force you to do anything without your consent, economically. And this is why a libertarian would argue against certain kinds of taxes, healthcare laws, things of that nature, and also argue against things like intrusive laws that are paternalistic. In other words, laws telling you what you can and cannot do with your body. Those are the state transgressing its bounds, according to libertarianism. The staunch individualism of libertarianism and ethical egoism is indeed that sticking point why they are equated with one another, even with these inconsistencies. Now, the author talks about what he calls the best argument for ethical egoism. I wrote the whole thing out, but we could do what with it? We could condense it into its structure. He says, this is what he calls the best argument for it. If you are morally required to do something, then you have good reason to do it. If you are morally required to do something, then you must have good reason to do it. And if there's a good reason to do it, then it ought to what? Make you better off. Therefore, if you are morally required to do something, then it will make you better off. Now, this argument is valid. Hypothetical syllogism. If R then G and if G then B, then if R then G follows. This is valid. But the author contends that the argument is unsound. On what grounds? The first premise is probably not bad. The sticking point is the second premise. If there is a good reason for you to do something, then doing it must make you better off. The author would contend that that begs the question. And it also goes against what many of us likely take for granted about morality. We think, maybe not all of us, but most people tend to think that there are reasons for doing certain things that are not merely what? Things that will make us better off. In other words, sometimes doing the right thing might mean what? Might mean doing something that does not directly benefit you. Maybe that's the case. Yeah, the author would contend that this second premise is false. Now, here are three other issues, problems for ethical egoism. This one's really a retread, folks. Violates our core moral beliefs. The author discussed this near the beginning of the chapter, where the author said that paradigm cases of immorality would end up being endorsed if we took ethical egoism seriously. Now, Rand would likely say, but I never say those things. Because her argument is largely an endorsement of this. Laissez-faire capitalism with a little Nietzschean overman thrown in, is how I like to put it. Her heroes tend to be what? Bold captains of industry, who the Mitt Romney crowd would call what? They are the makers. I'm using the political language that you've all heard. Now, the rest of us, who are just cogs in the whole system, what are we referred to in this kind of rhetoric? We are the takers. We don't build things up. We are actually the ones who are losers because we are reliant upon other people to give us jobs. It is the job creators who are the bold, rugged individuals who are out to create something for why? Because they want to. In other words, they are kind of acting out of their own creativity. Or I guess in many cases it's for economic reasons. In other words, you want to get rich, that kind of thing. But yeah, it's an argument for laissez-faire capitalism. The good guys, according to this argument, are the makers. The bad guys are the takers. I would be defined as one of the takers. Because why? Because I didn't create my own business. You know, that kind of thing. I'm working for the man, to use that cliche. I'm dependent upon, well, the man's also dependent upon me, by the way. You get my drift? That's the problem, and that's the problem in the end with both Rand and what I call Romneyism. It sets up a sort of straw man with a false dilemma. In other words, there's only two sides of the world. Entrepreneurs, and then the workers who are dependent upon them. There's something that false dichotomy forgets about. The so-called makers wouldn't have an opportunity to be makers if there were no society that needs these things. And also if there were no workers to actually build the stuff and put things together. In other words, we forget about the fact that this country was built off the backs of the working class. In many cases, what kind of members of the working class? Immigrants. You know, who came here looking for a better life, you know, from Ireland, from Eastern Europe, wherever. I'm talking 19th century stuff here. You know, before this country was built as we know it. But yeah, the working class is almost always treated as, you know, takers according to this. The captains of industry are the makers. Now, but yeah, it violates our core moral beliefs because it would say that many paradigm cases of morality would count as immorality because the only moral initiative in this system is bettering the self. Number two, egoism cannot account for the existence of moral rights. Now, folks, the author, in my opinion, wasn't entirely clear on this discussion of moral rights. So I'll give you the easiest example. Libertarianism argues that we do have moral rights. Because we are individuals, each of us have a right to property in our own body. We also have at least a minimal right not to be what? According to libertarianism. What is sometimes called a liberty or a negative right. A right not to be interfered with without my permission. The problem the author says is ethical egoism would not give any basis for the existence of moral rights. Because ethical egoism doesn't talk about one. It actually does not even talk about rights. It speaks of your one moral duty being a duty to yourself. And then whatever you want to do for other people, that's on you. But you would be a jackass if you were to do things for other people that would not what? That would not benefit you. But yeah, there would be no room for moral rights because in fact, ethical egoism would say in some circumstances, you would actually have a duty to violate people's so-called rights. And you actually probably should do it if it will benefit you and you can, of course, get away with it. That's the other thing, if you can get away with it. Now, here's the biggie, and philosopher James Rachels talks about this problem too. Egoism arbitrarily makes my interests all important. Now, the question is the fact that I'm me, and you're you, and everybody is whoever you are, Is there any good reason that I should count my interests as being more important than anyone else's? The author of the text says no. And James Rachels would actually gives an argument by analogy. He says that this argument is actually parallel to arguments made by racists and sexists, who will elevate their race on the basis of it being their own race. Or the sexists, who will elevate the interests of a particular sex simply because it is theirs. Philosophy typically says that if we're going to contend that certain individuals' interests matter more than other people's interests, we should at least provide a what? The easy answer is a good reason. The fact that I'm me doesn't really give me a reason to say that my interests matter more than everyone else's. As a matter of fact, this is something that we need to train out of our children. You know what I'm talking about? Mine, me, give it to me, I want it. Well, wait a minute, that belongs to somebody else. Well, I don't care if it belongs to somebody else, I want it. We have to train our children that they are not the center of the universe. Most of you probably don't believe that you're the center of the universe and that your interests aren't the only ones that matter. The author contends that if ethical egoism is true, then you have no real grounds to believe that anybody's interests really do matter in and of themselves, except for your own. That also goes against everything most of us think about morality. Now, in conclusion, I've already talked about why the author contends that we should reject ethical egoism, as well as why ethical egoism continues to be popular, even though there are serious differences between ethical egoism and libertarianism. Part of it is a lot of its consistency with the American ideology. Do note that part of the appeal to EE is that it does give importance to the individual, which is, like I said, part of the American ideology. And it would seem to counter the versions of altruism that seem to count the individual as having no importance. However, I've said this before and I'll repeat it again. However, the crucial error is that Rand has perhaps committed two logical errors. First, setting up a straw man, and the second, a false dilemma. Now, a false dilemma means treating a situation as if there are only two alternatives. Complete altruism versus what? Versus complete egoism. The problem is, nobody takes this position seriously. I don't know anyone who says you ought to not care about yourself at all. The fact is, there are no ethical theories that we will discuss that says you can never ever think about yourself. She treats other ethical theories as if they think that way. All other ethical theories will say is, you matter. However, other people what? Yeah, other people have intrinsic worth too. Their interests matter also. Now, the reason why there's also a straw man is because a straw man happens when we misrepresent or distort an opposing point of view. No ethical theory says that you ought to be 100% selfless all of the time. Not even Christianity says that. Love thy neighbor as you love thyself. There's self-love there too. Not even Immanuel Kant says that you should 100% just look out for other people and the Hades with yourself. So in other words, we get a distortion of what altruism means. What most of us mean by altruism is, yes, other people matter, but yeah, my interests matter also. My interests don't matter any more than anyone else's, even though I thought they did when I was a small child. And I sometimes act as if I think that way in the immature parts of my adult life. When I think, well, what about me? Nobody cares about me. Well, guess what? They do care about you. Stop being selfish. Have a good one.